Okay, so let me do the share screen one more time. Okay, so like I said, my name is Maya Schonbach, and I'm a clinical psychologist near the end of my training. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the recent neurobiology research that's been done and being conducted about skin picking and hair pulling disorder. So today what we're going to talk about first is why neurobiology. So why is neurobiology important for us to learn about, to study? We'll talk specifically about some of the neurobiology of BFRB, or body-focused repetitive behavior subtypes, and a recent study that was just conducted about that. And then I'll talk about three well-known mechanisms that are thought to be underlying skin picking and hair pulling disorder. And the first is response to stressors, the other is reward processing, and then finally behavioral control. And we'll talk about how some of the neurobiology research behind that and how they maybe are underlying the disorders. Finally, I'll do a summary of the research that I'll be presenting, and I'll talk about how it ties into therapy and how some of those implications. And then finally, I'll give a short reminder about neuroplasticity. And I know that's something that Vladimir already talked about in the past, but it really is very important, especially when talking about neurobiology. And then we can do a short Q&A at the end. And if anyone is just joining now, Vladimir, the previous clinical lead, will be with us in the chat. So if you have any questions throughout, feel free to write in, and then he'll answer them. And then also at the end, we'll do a brief Q&A. So to start off, why neurobiology? Why is neurobiology important to understand? So first of all, it gives us a deeper understanding of the disorders literally from within the brain. So like I said, I'll be talking about specific subtypes. And if we can understand a neurobiological basis for different subtypes, then maybe we can specify treatment to these different subtypes and to these different neural substrates or neural constructs. And we can really personalize treatment to every individual. And I think a goal in the future, for sure, for all of neurobiological science, is ideally prevention. So if we can perhaps determine that there's some different constructs in the brain or different network patterns, different function, and we can detect it at an early age, then maybe we can even prevent certain disorders in the future from people from developing them. So specifically with skin picking or hair pulling disorder. So there currently are a lack of clear pathophysiological targets, and that means that there's multiple brain areas and many circuits that have been examined in a variety of small studies, and often the studies have very conflicting results. So what I wanted to talk about first is a study done by a group from the University of Chicago, along with other medical institutions, and here is the citation in case you want to look into it more. So what they thought is that if people are to find meaningful biological differences in the subtypes of a disorder, then those subtypes should be well established. So what they did first is they did a study initially in which they used a bunch of different clinical measures and cognitive measures, and they found evidence for 3 different subtypes of hair pulling. So the first subtype, they call them sensory sensitive pullers, and they're characterized by highly focused pulling. They have infrequent and low intensity urges to pull. That was the first subtype. The second subtype were low awareness pullers, and they're characterized by more automatic pulling and pulling due to emotional triggers. And then finally, the third subtype, they called impulsive and perfectionist pullers. And they described these as those who pull in order to control unpleasant feelings and feel unable to resist their urge to pull. And then in terms of skin picking, they found two different subtypes. So the first subtype was emotional and reward pickers. And these were described as having strong and frequent urges to pick, as well as picking due to negative emotions and automatic picking. And they reported very little control over their urges to pick. And then the second subtype of skin picking, they described as functional pickers. And those had more milder skin picking. They had less urges to pull and overall less distress and less impact from the picking. And so essentially what they wanted to determine is if this clinical subtyping reflected a unique biological basis or an underpinning in the brain. So what this group did was they conducted an MRI neuroimaging study, initially on adults, and they did them on adults with a BFRB, as well as they included healthy controls. And the main findings that they discovered was that the low awareness hair pullers demonstrated an increased cortical volume in the lateral occipital lobe compared to controls and relative to the other subtypes. And so here, this is a diagram of the brain, looking at it from the side. And the occipital lobe, you can see is here, in the back of your brain. And so they found it in the lateral occipital lobe. So lateral is on the side, as opposed to medial, more towards the midline of the brain. And so in addition to visual perception, so occipital, like ocular visual, the lateral occipital cortex is involved in touch and proprioception sensory activation. So what proprioception is your body's ability to sense movement, action, and your body's location in space. So really it's present in every single muscle movement that you have. And so it was interesting that the low awareness hair pullers, they actually appeared to be the most common subtype of hair pulling. And again, these are the subtype that are characterized as having more automatic hair pulling and pulling due to more emotional triggers. Now, the other key finding that they found was that impulsive or perfectionist hair pullers, they found that they had relatively decreased volume near the lingual gyrus of the inferior occipital parietal lobe. So the occipital lobe is here and the parietal lobe is here. So in between there. And research shows that this lingual gyrus is associated with visual memory and motion imagery. And then in addition, there's also some indication that the lingual gyrus plays a role in response inhibition and in the context of negative emotions and in reward processing. And remember about reward processing, because we'll talk about that soon. And so something that really good that this article showed and this group published was that they published some null findings. They published results that didn't show up. So they reported that they didn't find that the subtype of the sensory sensitive pullers, they didn't find that they differed from the other clinical subtypes or from the controls in any structural manner in the brain. And then similarly, they also didn't find that the clinical phenotyping, so the two different subtypes of skin picking, they didn't find that there were any significant differences in brain structure in those subtypes as well. So what they were suggesting is they said maybe the lack of the structural differences in these different subtypes, it could mean that these subtypes might be less meaningful biologically, which could be true. And then they kind of gave the classic example, as they said, maybe the sample wasn't big enough to detect very, very subtle differences, which could be true for sure. But really it could mean that maybe skin picking is a more homogeneous or more similar disorder. And then really hair pulling could be maybe separated into these two subtypes. This is what they found. Oh, and I want to just give a clause that this is all very recent studies. This study was published, I believe, 1 year ago, and everything needs to be replicated. I'm just showing you really the cutting edge research here. Okay, so there's a variety of ways to understand behaviors of skin picking and hair pulling. So one way is as a response to stressors. So there's a range of different neurocircuitry that's involved in responding to stressors. So basic science shows that first what happens is that the sensory pathways process the stressors, and this happens through peripheral neurons, so from the outside. So imagine like you see a stressor, and it conveys the information to a central relay station like the thalamus, which you can see here. And this is all part of the limbic system in the inner part of your brain, deep inside. And so next what happens is that the amygdala here plays a key coordinating role. And what it does is it sends efferent fibers, so externally, to a range of different regions in the brain that are involved in the fight or flight response. And they're activated. And so in the fight or flight response, it includes the hypothalamus, which you can see here, as well as the brainstem, which isn't labeled, but it's here in the back of your brain. Again, this is the side view. This is the back of your brain. And basically your hypothalamus is a structure, again, deep inside your brain, and it acts kind of as a smart control coordinating center. And its main function, as written here, is homeostasis. It's to keep your body in a stable state. And how it does this is by influencing different hormones and influencing your autonomic nervous system. And then again, your brainstem, this is a really primitive part of your brain, really like old part. And it's responsible for the vital functions of life. So breathing, heart rate, blood pressure. And it's interesting because these are all the elements that you feel, the physiological aspects of the fight or flight response. And that's controlled by mostly by the brainstem. See some hands being raised. I'll just make sure. Okay, I'll speak a little slower. And the name of this study is written here, and we'll be posting the slides. The name of the study is the Neurobiology of Subtypes of Trichotillomania and Skin Picking Disorder, and it was published in CNS Spectrums. Okay. So another mechanism thought to influence BFRBs is reward processing. So why do we think this? So first of all, pulling and picking is often described as pleasurable and rewarding. And also performing the behaviors of the picking and pulling, it leads to a short-lived reduction or a relief of the urge, which is in of itself rewarding. Additionally, the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, so the book that we use to diagnose disorders, it includes failed attempts to reduce the behavior. And this in of itself is suggestive of reward dysfunction. Additionally, research shows that people with BFRBs were more likely than controls to have first-degree relatives with substance addictions. And these are disorders that are typically characterized by reward processing abnormalities. So that's interesting that there's a familial connection there. And then additionally, although these studies are limited in number, there are some studies that have shown that there is some benefit for BFRBs that use medication that influences glutamate and dopamine neurotransmitters. So these are chemicals in the brain, both of which are really integral in reward processing. So as you can see, there's evidence for dysregulated reward circuitry in BFRBs. So reward seeking and loss or harm avoidance, they play important roles in human behavior. And when there's the dysfunction in this reward processing, maladaptive behaviors may result. And these maladaptive behaviors may really be the skin picking or the hair pulling. So here's another study that I wanted to present. This one was published in 2021, so 2 years ago. So as I just said, reward processing dysfunction has really been implicated in the cause and as well as the sustention, so the continuation of skin picking and hair pulling disorders. So in this study, what they did was they used functional brain imaging, or fMRI, and they asked participants to do what they call a monetary reward task. And so in this kind of a task, participants are required to react to a certain target stimulus that's presented after an incentive cue to either win or to avoid losing a certain reward. And so in doing so, this task allows researchers to really examine different stages of reward processing under different reward conditions. And so this sample, as you can see here, included 159 adults. 125 of them had a BFRB. And of those, they actually had them separated into some that just had trichotillomania, some that just had skin picking disorder, and then some that had both skin picking as well as hair pulling disorder. And then they also included 34 healthy controls in order to do a comparison. Okay, so one of the main findings of this study is, this is actually a figure from the paper, figure 1. And what you can see here is that compared to controls, participants with BFRBs showed an increased activation in 2 significant areas during the anticipation of the reward during the WIN trials. So here you can see the brain. This is an image from the back of the brain. This is the left side and the right side. This is from the side, and this is from the top view. And so area 1, the 2 significant areas for participants with BFRBs, the first significant area was at the left inferior frontal gyrus, and area 2 was maximal at the right inferior frontal gyrus. We'll talk about what this inferior frontal gyrus is shortly. But this is during WIN trials. And then during the anticipation of reward in a loss trial, participants with BFRBs also showed an increased activation relative to controls in 4 different clusters. So you can see here 1, 2, 3, 4. And then again, this is the brain from the back, the brain from the side, and the brain from above. And then when they compared the clinical groups, so again, they had different clinical groups. They had a group just of hair pulling disorder, just of skin picking disorder, and then one with both. And when they compared all 3 clinical groups with the controls, in terms of here of this loss anticipation, all 3 clinical groups exhibited significantly greater activation only in areas 3 and 4. So here, 3 and 4, when compared to controls. So areas 1 and 2 only had 1 clinical group differ from the controls. So really, the main findings here were area 3 and 4. And then what are these areas? Area 3 was maximal at the left inferior frontal gyrus, and area 4 was maximal at the right inferior frontal gyrus. So again, like we found in the WIN trials. So essentially, the main finding of this study was a hyperactivation, so increased activation of the bilateral, so left and right, bilateral, inferior frontal gyrus, or IFG, in people with BFRBs compared to controls when anticipating reward or punishment. So these results were actually remained significant even when they did statistical correction, when they controlled for potential confounders. So these were very robust findings. And this is interesting because other studies found that the IFG is activated in reward processing tasks, including reward anticipation. And then excess IFG thickness was found in a recent meta-analysis. So a recent study of people specifically with trichotillomania or hair pulling disorder. This finding of the excess IFG thickness was also extended to first degree relatives of people with trichotillomania, but this was done in a study with a relatively small sample. So the inferior frontal gyrus is involved in the suppression of habitual response patterns. So for example, hair pulling or skin picking, these could be habitual response patterns. And studies have shown that response inhibition deficits, so the inability to inhibit responses, have been found in individuals with right IFG damage. So, and then also there's been research shown that if you damage the right IFG, and you can disrupt it using transmagnetic cranial magnetic stimulation. And so what that is you can put a cap on a person's head and shoot magnetic waves through the skull and target a specific brain area. And so if you can disrupt the right IFG using this, then you can actually cause response inhibition to be impaired. So essentially what this is all kind of showing is that it makes sense that the IFG is involved in BFRBs, which is cool. And one interpretation of the data, all this data that the researchers proposed in the paper is that the IFG may be overactivated when people with BFRBs are anticipating reward or punishment. And then this in turn might impede the ability of the brain or of this region to perform other cognitive functions like top-down behavioral inhibition of automated behavior. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of questions and raised hands. I think Vladimir will be answering these shortly. And if not, we can discuss these at the end. Okay. So a final mechanism thought to be involved in the behaviors of skin picking and hair pulling is the element of behavioral control. So there's a range of behavioral control mechanisms that may be altered in BFRBs, and they can range from simple motoric actions like the actual picking or the actual pulling to more complex decision making. So it could be the decision to pick or pull as opposed to do something else, maybe to alleviate the distress felt. It could be to whether to make the complicated decision to do mindfulness. So executive control involves the higher thinking skills that allow us to organize, to manage, and to control our behavior. And so the prefrontal cortex, and as you can see here in blue, and the neurons that connect to a variety of the subcortical structures here, they play, mainly the prefrontal cortex, plays a key role in this executive control. And in particular, the frontal striatal circuits are these neural pathways that connect the frontal regions of the prefrontal cortex. So here in your brain, again, this is a side view of your brain. This is the front part. This is the back, the brainstem. So the frontal striatal circuits are neural pathways that connect the prefrontal cortex with the basal ganglia, as seen here. And the basal ganglia are also called the striatum. And so these frontal striatal circuits, they control a variety of motor and cognitive and behavioral functions in the brain. And so it's actually interesting that it's been shown that these frontal striatal circuits are disrupted both in impulsive disorders. So for example, in ADHD, where there's decreased prefrontal control, as well as in compulsive conditions. So in here, maybe there's other compensatory mechanisms being used in the brain. So neurobiology research provides us with a deeper understanding of these disorders, literally from within. And like I said, a deeper understanding really can help therapists better connect to their patients, as well as provide more accurate treatment. So research on subtypes of skin picking and hair pulling disorders can allow for more personalized treatment. And the researchers of the study that I presented here, they hypothesized whether the various subtypes respond differently to different treatments. So maybe, like I said at the beginning, maybe if we find a more concrete biological basis of these subtypes, then we can create a more personalized treatment for the various subtypes and for more people. And then in terms of response to stressors, calming the limbic system, like I showed in the previous slide, and this includes the amygdala, which activates your fight or flight response. So calming the limbic system may help with this aspect of, with this mechanism of BFRBs. And so studies have shown that the amygdala's response to emotional stimuli, it's lower, the response is lower when people are in a meditative state of mindfulness, of mindful attention. So maybe mindfulness can help with this aspect of BFRBs. And that's really why within Skin Pick and Trick Stop, we really talk a lot about mindfulness and how important it is. And then for reward processing, the authors of the research presented here, they propose that the treatment of BFRBs using medications, they didn't say which medications, I'm assuming it's medications that haven't been discovered yet or released yet, that these medications might dampen subcortical reward pathways. And then that in turn could allow the IFG, or the inferior frontal gyrus, to be able to free up more top-down control for actually doing more processing capacity and have more prefrontal ability to do process. And then finally, for behavioral control, this really is the B in CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy. So in terms of CBT, for treating skin picking or hair pulling disorder, HRT, or habit reversal training, is really the gold standard. And so HRT, it works on the principle of competing responses. And so in its simplest terms, competing responses mean that a person can't do two opposing things at the exact same time. And so the ultimate goal of this HRT is facilitating behavioral change and ultimately allowing us to have more control over our behavior. So I really didn't want to do this talk without talking a little bit about neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity, or brain plasticity, it really is the ability of neural networks in the brain to change through growth and reorganization. So it's when the brain is rewired in order to function in a new way that differs from how it previously functioned. So examples of neuroplasticity include circuit and network changes that result from maybe learning new skills, practicing things, maybe even environmental influences, and even psychological stress that can cause neuroplasticity to occur. And really the core of this phenomenon is based on synapses, which are where the two neurons, the axons, they meet, and how the connections between the neurons, they change based on the neuron functioning. So really it is the idea that neurons that fire together, they wire together. So the idea of brain plasticity, what it does is it really gives us some agency and ultimately an element of responsibility over our brains. So even with all of the research that I presented here, about neurobiology and about skin picking disorder and hair pulling disorder that maybe this leads us to behaving in a certain way. Even with all of this research, we really do have the ability to change our brains through repeated learning and through practice. And that really is what Skin Pick and Trick Stop try to promote. So that being said, neuroplasticity is a very, very slow process. So it requires patience, it requires time, and a lot of repetition. So ultimately, if you want to change your brain's response to stressors or to reward processing or even behavioral control, you can modify it at a structural level in the brain. But it really does take a lot of discipline and effort. So any questions? I guess I can stop the recording.